It's an honor to have you here today and to share with us your reflections. And so I present to you Mark Stringer.
What a treat it has been to be here tonight and see a lot of familiar faces that I should have known I would see, but for some reason I guess I didn't expect it. I don't know. But I was telling one of my best friends, somebody I roomed with in college, he was the best man at my wedding. He's a devout Catholic. He lives in Cleveland, Ohio. And I said, hey, I'm speaking at this dinner tonight, a Catholic peace ministry, and it's not very often that I get to speak in a Catholic church. And he said, I'll wait for the thunderclap from Cleveland. I said, I'm going to use that joke. He said, please do. Again, thank you for the privilege of speaking to you tonight at this time in our shared history as Iowans, as Americans, as fellow seekers and defenders of what is peaceful, fair, and just. I'm especially honored on behalf of the ACLU of Iowa that I serve to be here on the night that our ally, client, and friend, Iowa MMJ, is being recognized for the exceptional work that it does, which we are proud to say and humbled to say has included some partnership with us. Most recently, Iowa MMJ has led the way in challenging and working with us towards successfully blocking SF 2340, the worst anti-immigrant law in the history of the state. SF 2340 conflicts with existing federal law by directing Iowa law enforcement to arrest immigrants who have authorization to be here. This includes people granted asylum, those who have been given visas to protect victims of crime, trafficking, or domestic violence, those who have had one of the other dozens of authorized immigration statuses, including special protections for immigrant youth. The law even directs local law enforcement to arrest green card holders who have lived here for years and who have families here. It is an ugly law and is deeply harmful to Iowa families and communities. Iowa MMJ was particularly well positioned to be in the lead on a challenge of this law because of their immigrant-led advocacy and immigration legal services program, which enabled our collaborative effort to quickly identify people who would likely be impacted were this law to take effect, thereby leading to a successful pre-enforcement challenge, and we're grateful for that. Iowa MMJ also continues to lead the way when it comes to preparing and providing important Know Your Rights information, both to immigrants and to the organizations that serve and support them, such as schools, churches, hospitals. And they are the best referral site for people to connect with competent immigration counsel, especially in Iowa, where we have very low numbers of immigration attorneys. The fact is, our state is a better place because of Iowa MMJ. So on behalf of the ACLU of Iowa's entire team, we join all of you, in thanking and honoring them tonight. So these are harrowing times. Complicated, confusing, divisive, confounding times. Times unlike any other, or so it may seem. But the painful truth is that rights and liberties in this country have always been at risk, have always needed people like you and me, and for more than a century, the ACLU to defend. Just over 105 years ago, in the years following World War I, many in America were gripped by a fear that the communist revolution that had taken place in Russia would spread to the United States. As is often the case when fear overwhelms rational debate, civil liberties paid the price. U.S. Attorney General Mitchell Palmer began rounding up and deporting so-called radicals in what became known as the Palmer Raids. Thousands of people were arrested without warrants, without regard to constitutional protections against unlawful search and seizure. Those arrested were brutally treated and held in horrible conditions. In the face of these egregious civil liberties abuses, a small group of people decided to take a stand and they created the American Civil Liberties Union. About 15 years later, here in Iowa, another small group of forward-thinking activists, not unlike yourselves, led by an ISU math professor, Edward Allen, were concerned about an Iowa criminal syndication law that was being misused by the state to detain and prosecute dissenters who spoke out publicly against the government. And so they created the Iowa Civil Liberties Union, only the fifth affiliate of the national ACLU at the time. The other affiliates were in Boston, Baltimore, LA, and San Francisco, and then Des Moines. One of the first victories of what would become the ACLU of Iowa, which is what we're called today, occurred later that year in 1935 when a bill was introduced in the Iowa legislature that would require a loyalty oath of all Iowa teachers. Popular legislation nationally at the time that was seen as a method of somehow ferreting out communist sympathizers. That bill eventually died a quiet death in legislative committee. But one wonders today, were a loyalty oath for teachers bill to be introduced in the Iowa legislature, would it be so easily stopped? One thing is certain, you can be sure the ACLU and many of you here tonight would do all we could to stop it. Can I get an amen? Come on now. But that we have to even ask ourselves, could such a bill pass today, is evidence of the importance that we all stay vigilant to protect and preserve the freedoms we may too often take for granted before they're gone. But that we, for 90 years now here in Iowa, and for 105 years nationwide, now with affiliates in every state, the ACLU, thanks to our supporters, has evolved from these small groups of individuals, idealists, protecting the freedom to think, to speak, to protest without fear of government censorship or bullying. We've transitioned into the nation's premier defender of the rights enshrined in the U.S. and state constitutions. When I think back to those activists, those small groups of people, I'm reminded of that quote of 20th century cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead that many of you probably know. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." The ACLU of today now has more than 1 million members and donors, over 2,100 staff nationwide, and we continue to fight government abuse and to vigorously defend a broad array of individual freedoms, including speech, religion, the right to due process, citizens' right to privacy, preserving and advancing voting rights, reproductive rights, LGBTQ+ rights, gender justice, racial justice, immigrants' rights, criminal legal system reform, and more. The ACLU stands up for these rights even when the cause is unpopular, and sometimes when no one else will. We remain a champion of segments of the population who have traditionally been denied their rights, with much of our work today focused on equal rights under the law for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, women, gay, lesbian, and transgender folk, prisoners, immigrants, and people with disabilities. Americans, while not always in agreement with us on every issue, at least not by my voicemail, have come to count on the ACLU for its unyielding dedication to principle and nonpartisanship. We have no permanent allies or adversaries. Our commitment, above all else, is to civil liberties and civil rights, and our mission is truly liberty and justice for all. Back in 1920, the individual freedoms named in the Constitution had never fully been tested in the courts, making them largely meaningless for ordinary people. But since then, principles of individual freedom, protection against arbitrary government action and overreach, freedom of religion, freedom of speech and press, due process, equal protection, privacy, they've become codified in many of our laws, and their protections widely enforced, if not expected. The advancement of these civil rights and social justice advancements over the past century represent some of the most significant developments in American history, and the ACLU has been integral to this process. In 1925, when biology teacher John Scopes was charged with violating a Tennessee ban on the teaching of evolution, the ACLU was there, securing attorney Clarence Darrow for Scopes' defense. The trial made national headlines, helped persuade the public of the importance of academic freedom. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt ordered all people of Japanese descent, most of whom were American citizens, to be sent to war relocation camps. Eventually, over 100,000 Japanese Americans were sent to these internment camps. The ACLU, led by its California affiliates, stood mostly alone in speaking out about this atrocity at the time. In the 1950s, the ACLU joined forces with the NAACP to challenge racial segregation in public schools. The resulting Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education ended the era of separate but equal and was a major victory for racial justice. In the 60s, the ACLU, especially here in Iowa, won a landmark Supreme Court victory on behalf of Des Moines public school students John and Mary Beth Tinker, who were suspended for wearing black armbands in protest of the Vietnam War. We continue to stand up for free speech protections, both for teachers and students in public schools today. In the wake of the events of 9/11, another time when fear was leading Americans to sacrifice fundamental freedoms in the name of national security, the ACLU was steadfast in opposing the Patriot Act, challenging warrantless spying and the indefinite detention of terrorism suspects without charge or trial. And the ACLU remains committed to restoring fundamental freedoms lost as a result of any government policies that expand its power to invade privacy, imprison people without due process, and punish dissent. This commitment becomes more essential by the day given the threats and actions of the current Trump administration. Just 1 week ago, the administration sent nearly 250 Venezuelan immigrants to a maximum security prison in El Salvador without hearings or other due process. The government claims that it was authorized to do so under the Alien Enemies Act, a controversial 18th century law addressing presidential authority in wartime that was last used to justify those internment camps I mentioned earlier during World War II, one of the most shameful times in American history. The government's claim that it can round up people without due process is breathtaking, it's lawless, and it puts people at extraordinary risk of arrest, detention, and deportation without any chance to tell their side of the story, resulting from only an immigration agent's say-so, without any oversight from a judge. This is unacceptable. We immediately sued and secured a judicial order to halt the deportations, an injunction that was upheld just Wednesday by an appeals court in Washington, D.C. And so the litigation will continue. Meanwhile, hundreds of individuals will remain much more protected from being sent to prison in a foreign country without due process. We're also litigating with others on behalf of Mahmoud Khalil, a recent graduate student at Columbia University, who's been detained and threatened with deportation in retaliation for his speech defending Palestinian human rights. We're challenging the deportation of a Georgetown professor who was also targeted because of his advocacy in support of Palestinian rights. And just yesterday, we joined the legal team from Ruqayya Ozturk, a former Fulbright scholar, Tufts University PhD student who came to the U.S. on a student visa and who was grabbed, arrested, and detained in Massachusetts before being sent to Louisiana right off the street by plainclothes federal agents this week in apparent retaliation for a student newspaper op-ed she co-authored last year. So, you can see the same type of egregious, unjustifiable government actions, the warrantless detention of so-called radicals that led to the creation of the ACLU in the first place over 100 years ago continues today, and therefore, so does our work. We have lots of people that are familiar with the ACLU in the room, probably most of you, but I thought it would be a good idea to kind of help you understand how we work And we work in three primary ways. The first is litigation, which is how we're most known. That's bringing cases in the courts and filing legal actions. But we also work in lobbying and policy arenas in the legislature and in city governments, advocating for legislation and policy that protects and advances rights and liberties, and providing our expertise on how best to do that, including trying to prevent bad legislation in the first place so that we don't have to sue. We clearly can't stop every bill that infringes on civil liberties and civil rights, painfully so, especially when one party has controlled all branches of state government for so long. But we can, because of our relationships on both sides of the aisle and our principled expertise, sometimes help improve bills. So in addition to the policy and legislative work, we also have a public education and advocacy wing. And that's the part of our organization that does Know Your Rights trainings, continuing legal ed, public forums. That's our social media presence. And it's also a growing and impactful base of organized activists who are encouraged to engage in their democracy like you do. These three ways we work complement each other in our integrated advocacy approach that has been impactful here in Iowa in recent years, even against long odds, in areas including but not limited to limiting unnecessary police presence and the use of seclusion rooms in public schools, holding government officials accountable to open records requests, requiring that Iowans under Medicaid have access to equal care options, preserving and defending access to the polls for all eligible voters, educating and empowering Iowans to advocate for their reproductive rights, and ensuring that Iowans are able to exercise their First Amendment rights in a variety of settings, including lawful protest. We're also awaiting a district court decision in our challenge of the Iowa law for public schools that don't say LGBTQ, book banning, and forced outing law that we've been litigating for more than a year. Here in Iowa, we have about 10,000 supporters, many of whom are card-carrying members, and we rely on their financial support to do our work because we don't receive government funding. Why would we when we're always suing the government? In fact, challenging government overreach in court is one of the ACLU's nationwide priorities right now. We've already sued the current presidential administration 22 times in just over 2 months. Among these lawsuits include defending birthright citizenship, protecting the right to asylum, ending the unlawful deportation of immigrants to Guantanamo Bay. We are arguing on behalf of transgender and non-binary Americans impacted by a new policy requiring that U.S. passports reflect sex assigned at birth rather than how people know themselves, rolling back decades of State Department policy because every person deserves the right to move freely about the world safely and with dignity. We've also filed over 40 Freedom of Information requests to federal agencies demanding more information about DOJ's reckless, unauthorized access to our personal data. We are not pursuing any of this work for partisan political gain. We are doing so because the administration's actions require that we act. It's that simple. I hear from people who fear that these fights may already be lost because the courts have shifted too far in the direction of unchecked presidential power. But the facts, so far anyway, don't bear these fears out, and litigation remains a viable and perhaps the most effective tool to stop and or stall the worst federal offenses, including mass deportations of immigrants and attempts to silence, if not imprison, political opponents and dissidents. Regardless of what any of us thinks about the makeup of the U.S. Supreme Court right now, that court handles fewer than 100 cases a year in total. Most federal cases are decided in district and appeals courts, overseen by more than 1,400 judges, less than 17% of whom were appointed by President Trump. So we will continue to push back in the courts on government abuses of power, especially to protect immigrant communities by preventing mass deportations where we can and unconstitutional detentions. We will increase bodily autonomy where we can in challenging gender-affirming care bans and defending the right to medically necessary care. And we will defend dissent through protecting free speech and the right to protest. We will not win every case. But with the help of our supporters, we will keep doing what we have always done. We will join with directly impacted people to advocate and litigate for constitutionally protected rights. We will play the long game just as we always have. We will not give up. We don't give up. And along the way, we will educate and encourage everyone to participate in this quintessentially American, in the best sense of the word, endeavor, seeking a more perfect union with liberty and justice for all. I know, thank you. I know these are challenging times. The staff I have the privilege to work with and I feel it, our donors feel it, you feel it. These are challenging times. They feel unprecedented, and in some ways they are. But history teaches we have been through similar challenges before and that we can expect more to come. And that's why we have to stay engaged. One of the founders of the ACLU of Iowa, Edward Allen, said nearly 50 years ago, "It is certain," he was very prescient, "it is certain," he said, "that we will always have civil liberties problems in Iowa, some of natures we cannot yet guess. Therefore, we should be the best embodiment of the state's motto, our liberties we prize and our rights we will maintain." Roger Baldwin, the ACLU's first executive director, summed up the purpose of our organization and the work we all share when he said, "So long as we have enough people in this country willing to fight for their rights, we will be called a democracy." As shameless as today's attacks on our civil rights and liberties are, they are merely the latest chapter in the multi-generational pursuit of a nation worthy of the ideals we claim to hold. And at least for the last 100 years, the ACLU has been there working for all of us, and we are committed to being there in the future as well. As the ad we ran in the New York Times the day after this past November's election stated, "We are the American Civil Liberties Union, and we aren't moving to Canada." Thank you again for inviting me to be here tonight and for all you do to advocate for your rights and the rights of your neighbors. Our democracy depends on all of us. Our democracy depends on it. Thank you.